Nhớ rằng sau lên sẽ tướng đã là cú ya hoa nè cả trong share trả tạo tuần trí này sau YouTube nó cú và thấy cái share tại nên sau lên sẽ tướng chỉ sẽ cái nó cá nhau sống và nên cái đó thôi nên muốn chăm ba thay đó mà là cú gì nó gọi là do là gì cũng gọi lý thế ở châu này sẽ đợi chừng cho cái đó bé cho nhớ đấy là tôi sai nếu nào cú ya là nhận tuần plau trên nó ra đó nên lần tương bán thế giờ lên tới thôi nên sẽ là còn cái là gì nó cú tiếp liền. Jisa watched as she entered the chamber with a frightened look on her face. The hilarious miscommunication from earlier still played in his mind, and he couldn't stop laughing. When it entered his thoughts, he had a smile on his face, remembering how innocent she truly was. Now, as she stood before him, her hands laced together like a child caught stealing, he was feeling every bit curious as to what she looked like beneath the getup. He said. She moved 2 steps, and laughter erupted for him. He moved across the room, and she took several steps back. Ya Olika, he asked. She finally looked up at him. Có sót giả ti cô. Cô hay có hai tia cô. Cô tưởng quan trẻ yên từ mình nhỏ học lá lợ. Cô chỉ gợi thông câu hụ. Crossing his arms and liking how she suddenly switched tactics, he grinned and replied, Tia li, thầu tư có sự xin đó trẻ yên ổn gì rồi nè. Cô thiên nữ từ nhau kênh tại hình lợ. Giờ có chỉ cho cô, có sao vài tia có nhớ bỏ ta kì. Cô hay có bao, trẻ yên giờ ý tôi nâng xếp hệ hình. Giờ hai tia lưng từ trường sinh này nhạc không nữa thia. Nếu chủ ua cả, tôi nâng nâng có lo sơ. Nodding to make it look as if he understood, Jisa reached her in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms. She fought him, and he gathered her into his arms, bringing her to the bed. He laid her down and held her wrists together. Các tổng thể dân ý lần sư có dò dạp bảo hai tia lưu tụt xin nâng trong bộ lý cả. Khai của sợ, như các tổng thể dân trong bộ lý có hại. Ôi cha nâng họ chịu ôi tia cả chậu tố con nó. She didn't answer, and he could feel her body responding to him, making his heart come alive with a feeling that hadn't been present before. He lowered himself and kissed her lips gently, being careful not to scare her. While lost in his kisses, she relaxed against him, and he let her wrist go, where her hands found themselves around his neck. She began opening up to him, and he looked up at her swollen lips. Quiero cupatao, he asked. She didn't answer, but gave him a slight nod of her head, and when he took her maidenhood, her eyes fluttered open with pain and fright. He smiled, reaching up to wipe away the tears that had pooled at the corners of her eyes. Cất sâu những nhà cơ ạ. One day tôi bắt nhớ những mà tàu mình nhòa, nếu lúc kiến có sư ở chụp bùa. Rồi này quý thơ tu sa, chả cất sâu đào lùa. She had no words to say, only to hide her face beneath his arms, where pain soon became pleasure. The moon's ray came through the window pane and glittered its light across her arms that lay on his chest. She was deep in sleep, her breath even as Jisa held her. This was going to be an adventure he would enjoy. Judging on her looks, he knew she wasn't commoner. She had a story, and he would intend to find that story out. But for the time being, her current status would keep her safe, so the ones who left her broken wouldn't find her. Once he arrived home, he would make her his own personal servant, serving only him. It had been a long time since he had one, and normally he preferred men, but this time he would cave in on his own rule to protect her. Why? Beats him, but he liked having her around. Jisa thought about his lengthened travel this time, and he had come up bare. For the past few years, he'd been trying to figure out the person responsible for his mother's death. Whoever had poisoned her had done so with a strange drink that couldn't be traced. His father had been out of court during that time, and the servants brought a drink containing the poison to her. There was no antidote found even from the greatest medicinal doctors. He'd watched as his mother took her last breath, coughing up blood, while his father tore a knee ligament trying to reach her in time. His older brothers all fought hard to find who it was but failed. When his father bestowed the crown to him, before he accepted it, he wanted to go on one last venture to find the culprit. But he'd come up empty as he did the past years. He knew it was someone inside the court hall, because no one else could be that protected. He would make sure court knew how important Ntxhi Laim was to him, and used her as a lure to find out who was behind it. His father had loved a woman, and it had cost him her life. He was sure if he pretended to follow his father's footsteps, the same murder would surface. But unlike his father, he would protect the woman by his side. Ntxhi Laim woke from the blaring of the horn, and she found herself alone. Last night was something she did not expect. She lifted the covers to find a small red stain on the bed, and her cheeks blushed. She quickly covered it and walked to dress. Once she finished, she raked her fingers through her hair, just as Jisa entered the chamber wearing all black. His eyes showed her what exactly he did last night. Again, she felt the heat to her cheeks, and he smiled. He asked. She cleared her throat and ignored him. She ignored his comment. He walked closer to her and crossed his arms. Ntxhi Laim frowned. Laughing, he replied, She didn't understand his riddles as he gestured for her to follow him. She did so, and he took her to where Dongxing was cooking. He smiled up at her as Jisa walked to the door and turned back around. Dongxing, he said as he left. Ntxhi Laim made a face and turned to find Dongxing blushing. Ntxhi Laim, Vì lý nó, nếu giờ in chỉ đang chỉ bảo chạy thế này, chỉ họ muốn chỉ lại, có chỉ bảo để你 lần tư lo. Shrugging, she replied, "Cô bảo để nếu lần bây giờ chỉ sao thế nếu in chỉ đang khẩu hình nó." Smiling, Dong Seng replied, muốn chỉ lại, nếu chỉ sao là mà, ta chỉ nếu họ tại rõ công tụt tuôn sợ, ta chỉ nó lúc rõ tây tờ đó tụt tu họ tại cái, giờ chỉ sao. This left Ntxhi Laim feeling dizzy, and she held onto the counter for support. So she slept with the crown prince last night? Oh, good Lord, would they kill her now? Wow, she asked. Chi toa. That she got to jagatotsi. La. The king had 5 sons. Jisa was the youngest and the current crown prince. The first eldest prince, Jiangya, was married to the princess of 4 Winds, Shizhong. They resided within the palace halls and came to visit here and there. The second eldest prince was Nyaojing. He was married to the princess of natives, Qaunduki, and lived in the natives' land with her and her family. He rarely came to court anymore. The third eldest prince was Gengda, who was abroad Spain and hadn't returned home. The fourth prince was Mengzu, who was still at home with the king, but had showed no signs of wanting to run the court. This left Jisa as the new crown prince. Ntxhi Laim's eyes widened. Well, the Jisa yin chinya kalung the bao nu meng ma. Ni yin mo ran ba. Ni yin get the side there ni pe seng da disu. Then Ntxhi Laim's eyes lit up, and she rushed out of the room. She ran down the stairs and into the chamber where she found Chisa looking over some papers. He looked up at her as she entered. She asked. He lowered his papers and a smile appeared. He set the papers down and crossed his arms. She walked closer to him and tears brimmed her eyes. She watched as he cocked his head, and then she dropped to the ground on her knees. She felt the hot tears roll down her cheeks. He walked to her and helped her stand up. Wiping away her tears, he pulled her closer to him. She fought him. He smiled. Smiling, he replied, Yolana. She knew right then her fate. He would never let her go. And he didn't believe a word she just said. She would be at his beck and call, forever just a servant, and until her womb carried his child, she would always be a step behind. She felt the pain throb inside her, and before she could help it, tears fell down her cheeks. She noticed how his eyes darkened at the sight of her change of emotions. He reached out and wiped her tears away. He asked gently. A kind smile appeared, and he touched her cheek gently. Bao 2 days later, they docked ship, and Ntxhi Laim changed into a yellow dress with a red sash around her waist to match Dong Seng and all the other servants. Jisa was nowhere to be found, and she walked with the servants off the ship where the men in black piled them up into carriages. She sat with Dong Seng and rode the half-hour long distance to a huge manor that looked fitting for a king. There were large green bushes that were cut in designs, and a flower garden with fountains and cherry blossoms that surrounded the entryway. More servants dressed in yellow came out, and the first carriage stopped. To her surprise, Jisa came out wearing all blue and quite different from the man she saw on the ship. Immediately, the male servants bowed on one knee, and the woman servants curtsied. Then, a beautiful woman wearing a lavender gown with white flowers in her hair came running out to hug him. She threw her arms around him, but his remained at his sides, not touching her. Ntxhi Laim couldn't hear what they said, but when she pulled away, he walked on ahead without her. She followed shortly after, and they were finally allowed to leave. Dong Seng took her hand when she came down and gestured for her to follow him. He led her away from the front entrance, and they entered through the back, where they went down the stairs into the darkened area, where there were small rooms with cots. Ntxhi Laim, kalu kepuyalu na, yam handung noheng, jajong katalakia chamandung baoka tigahamomo, he explained. She nodded, then walked ahead to the kitchen area, where a few servants were working. He led her out of the kitchen to another door where they walked into a dark room where there were pots of flowers. He gathered a few and handed one to her. She took it and followed him to the garden where he began to dig into the dirt. As she set the pots down, she raised her head to find a young woman with a bright smile coming to them. Nu Tongseng, tu có bây tu là hữu ở viên dòng Ntxhi Laim? She asked. Nodding, Tongseng replied, Mo yeki, yaka. She smiled and reached out to take her hand. Nhớ rằng viên dòng Ntxhi Laim, cô ya yeki, có hữu của ở viên dòng yeki. Cô mua cái gì là cho con thơ của mù? Mu, Tongseng said, pushing her toward the woman. Kashimu. Ntxhi Laim nodded and followed the woman back into the manor, where she led her out of the kitchen and into the main living area with the long hallways. Viên dầu yeki, có cho cô một trò tư hả? She asked. Thà ra lưu sen, cô luôn cho nhớ tới chỉ tao có. Again, with the strange wordings of their language, she didn't understand, so she only followed. And when Yeki bowed, she bowed. When she stopped, Ntxhi Laim stopped, until they reached a wing that was large with black-colored flags, and she stopped outside a door with two large black French doors connecting. She knocked and then opened. The two walked in, and Ntxhi Laim was surprised to see Chisa sitting at a table with a spread of fruits and snacks. He waved a hand, and Yeki backed out, leaving her alone with him. Law, he ordered. She did as told, and he stood up and pushed a basin of rose water toward her. He took her hands and placed them in, and began washing her hands, and then he dried them with a soft pink towel. Luce na yakulu. Xin hư namo, có yêu là nhá hồn nó. Cái sao lử ya đâu của chỉ có. Lử tên hơn chỉ có, cái chuyện nhà tế chuyện nhà sớm mũ hả lử. Có bằng cái xía? He asked. She opened and closed her mouth. Trả lời chạy của nè. She tilted her chin. Lần tiêu chuyện khánh giao chạy thia, ya mà của tớ nó khai cái chạy. Lần tiêu vật sổ có cái chuyện rải của. Có bằng nó. She nodded, and he bent down to give her a quick kiss, and then he took her hand and led her to sit down beside him. Namo, shock at all. She took a look at the food before her and reached for a plump strawberry. As she bit into the fruit, the juice escaped down her chin, and he beat her to wipe it with his fingers. And when he brought his hand back to taste, her eyes flew wide open. Kakungo, he whispered. She blushed, and the fruit became lodged in her throat. He watched her with those seductive eyes of his, and as he reached over to take her hand, the door to his room opened, and the pretty woman she saw earlier came barging in with a tea tray. She said as her smile faded when she saw Ntxhi Laim sitting there. She cocked her head to one side, and as Ntxhi Laim stood to go, he reached over and grabbed her arm, forcing her to sit. The action caused the girl to question their relationship. Dilau, tu có ya, she said as her voice faded. Ni ko tun saitsi, he said as he stood up. He took the tray from her and set it down. Có lo đã chị, cô tớ để cô chị không. Dilau, she started, but Jisa cut her off. Mu, ta có một chỗ cô chị, cô chị không đâu có nhau. Ntxhi Laim stood up and walked around to them. She smiled gently at her, but the woman didn't return it. Ta si vinh yao, có mà linh đâu nè nhau. She turned to go, and this time when Jisa reached out to stop her, the woman grabbed his hand. She took the time to leave and made it out the door just as she heard him yelling at her. Jisa ignored Gyochia's angry glare as Ntxhi Laim left his chamber. The woman did not know when to stop and was getting on his every last nerve. Ju, he asked. It wasn't that she wasn't pretty. She was. But she had an attitude that made the day long and hard to endure. She was also rude and had no filter to her words, a mixture that gave him headaches and eye rolls. Jisa, she cried as she stomped her foot. Got what you thought not kuna? What I going in here, go walk up say. Learn who chin day na sige, good la tea column baila na. Jisa laughed and pried her fingers off of him. Ye could see Jisa got the toy to do la galon do na. Could see Jisa go walk with the taja ijoli. Joku. He walked out of his chamber and down the hall to find Ntxhi Laim when Gyochia came to block his path. Cất sát sai tiệc của yếm nó có tên lù có hay. Giờ có chỉ sao tao của là của những môn lắm bè ô có tu là ná. Và thầu bí lão sư, yên yên đỡ xin gờ lợi. Có kia chỉ thao của, khỏi rong về có lần cũng gió về luôn nâng, luôn xì sơ là mà. Laughing, he replied, có chỉ bảo xăm hoa cái lì dọ. Thầu ấy tôi chỉ nâng chỉ nhẹ con, chẳng có yêu sở của cũng tên lê gấp luôn là của những chuyện chia có lì ọ. Giá kê. She refused to move, so he walked around her, and when she reached out, he darted past her and left her behind. 我找我那只能共同包的狗，同鸡那个月的是啥等待呢？被马里星期多，他那是人只给那干净中了吗？